Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I can't remember if I shared with you an experience I had in January of 1993 when I was in Jerusalem. I was there, we were in the city of Jerusalem over the Sabbath. And we were staying in a tall, high-rise hotel in the downtown section of Jerusalem. And I noticed a lot of couples coming in dressed to the nines for dinner. It was Sabbath, so they weren't allowed to cook, but evidently they were allowed to go out for dinner. I'm not sure how they got there, if they walked or if some other provisions were made, but the hotel was filled with people. All the banquet halls, all the restaurants were filled with people there for their Sabbath dinner. That didn't bother me, but what concerned me is when I went over to the elevators, on one of the elevators there was a sign that said Sabbath elevator. I had no idea what that meant, and I didn't want to cause offense in any way, so I went to the front desk and I said, "What does Sabbath elevator mean?" And he said, "Well, it seems that some board of rabbis decided that to press a button is work on the Sabbath. So this elevator is programmed to stop on each and every floor and open the door so people can get on and off without anybody having to press any buttons." And he says, so you can ride on it, but you're going to have to stop at every floor to get up to your room. I respect religious laws. I certainly respect the Ten Commandments, and keeping the Sabbath is one of the Ten Commandments. I sometimes think we take that rule a bit far. A Sabbath elevator would, in my book, fall as taking that rule a bit too far. And as an aside, and I know this is a sexist comment, but so pressing a button is too much work, but gussying up and putting your makeup on with a trowel wasn't too much work to go out to dinner. So we pick and choose how we're going to obey some of these laws. In our gospel lesson today, we find this law, and we're quite familiar with it because it's one of the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Now, if I were to ask for a show of hands by those who keep the Sabbath law, I wouldn't expect to see too many hands. The fact is that few Christians really observe the Sabbath, which for us technically falls on Sundays. We don't feel constrained to follow the Sabbath law, be it on Saturday or Sunday or any other day of the week. For the most part, we do what we want to do or what we're required to do on weekends as well as on weekdays. But like most laws, the Sabbath law makes sense when you really think about it. It makes sense in two ways. For one thing, the Exodus version of our reading from Deuteronomy says that God created the law prohibiting work on the Sabbath to honor the fact that God rested on the seventh day. Therefore, God called the Israelites to honor God by keeping the Sabbath holy and by themselves resting on the seventh day. But there's another reason as well. Even though Christians are no longer subject to Old Testament laws, we want to honor God. And we do need rest. In times past, when people obeyed the Sabbath law, they spent the day at home with their families. They could read or play games. Hopefully someone in the family could play a fiddle or the piano or guitar. And the family would gather around and sing songs together. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? We've lost something by ignoring the Sabbath law. Even though I have, again, a lot of problems with them as a denomination or sect, I got to give the Mormons credit. They take this family time seriously. They block out a time, each and every Mormon family, to spend together as family every week. Doing just this, playing games, reading together, singing together, doing activities together, whatever those activities might be. And their families tend to be stronger for it. So I applaud them on doing that. We've lost something by kind of ignoring the Sabbath law. But of course, not all people, either now or back in Jesus' day, could refuse to do all work on the Sabbath, especially in a rural economy. Cows needed milking on the Sabbath just as on every other day of the week. Sheep required a shepherd's protection every day of the week. Jesus notes in the Gospel of Matthew that people were allowed to rescue sheep that had fallen into a ditch on the Sabbath day. Luke tells us of Jesus saying that the same would be true if a child or an ox fell into a well on the Sabbath day. In our gospel lesson, Jesus bumps up against his enemies, the Pharisees, on 2 counts of violating the Sabbath law. In the first count, Jesus' disciples had plucked some grain to eat. Plucking grain from someone else's field might sound larcenous, but Torah law specifically allowed it, as long as you didn't use a sickle to harvest too much, just what you could pick. The Pharisees held Jesus responsible for the actions of his disciples. They said, look, why are your disciples doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? So Jesus reminded them of a story with which they would have been quite familiar. To understand the impact of the story, you have to understand that King David was not only Israel's greatest king, but David had also kind of become an iconic figure like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Pharisees could criticize Jesus, but they didn't dare criticize David. The story of David, in this story of David, he wasn't yet the king. David and his companions were fleeing from King Saul, who was jealous of David, as you recall, and was trying to kill David. David and his companions were hungry, so they asked a priest for bread. And the priest protested that the only bread available was the holy bread, which we might liken to the communion bread. And if David's young men had, but he said, I'll let you have the holy bread if you'll swear to me that your companions, your young men, had kept themselves from women. David assured him that that was the case. Frankly, I don't know if that was true or not. But David assured the priest that that was the case. The priest believed him, and he gave them the holy bread. And David and his companions ate the bread. Jesus concluded the telling of that story by saying, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. The Pharisees couldn't think of a response. Jesus won, Pharisees not. Well, that's an interesting take on the Sabbath, isn't it? The Sabbath is made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. You see, God intended the Sabbath as a blessing for his people. God intended the Sabbath to give people a day of rest. We all need some restful time, don't we? A few years ago, a Newsweek cover ran on which there was only one word. In large, bold letters, it said, exhausted. The article inside told stories of people, from the president of Harvard to single moms, to a father trying to juggle 2 jobs. All these people were exhausted. Everyone was exhausted. Can you identify with that? Is it any better today? I don't think so. While email has blessed us in many ways, and cell phones have made life easier in some ways, they've also broken down the barrier between workplace and home. For many people, it's as if they never leave work. They keep getting emails and text messages every single day at all hours. Emails that demand their attention. Doesn't matter that it's Saturday or Sunday. We need an answer to this email. These identify problems that have to be solved. We're surrounded by labor-saving devices, but we're still exhausted. So Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. God intended the Sabbath to bless us. The God who created us knows that we need rest, and intended the Sabbath to address that need. God knows that we need time with our families, and he intended the Sabbath to meet that need. While we're no longer required to observe the Jewish law, we would do well to set some limits. And maybe it can't be on Sunday afternoons and evenings, but maybe as families we can agree that Wednesday night is family night. Doesn't matter. That's the intent of the law. To make time for our loved ones, our family, for ourselves. I got a massage on Friday morning. I got to tell you, it was a treat. And But I thought, I deserve this. And I paid extra to have a 90-minute massage instead of an hour long because I wanted that extra 30 minutes. And I tell you, it felt great. It was good to pamper myself a little bit. And that's God's time. I took a little Sabbath for myself. I worked last night at my other job with the Board of Elections. I was there till 10 o'clock at night. And my boss was still there, along with some of my other coworkers. And she says, "So are you working tomorrow morning?" Because she knows what I do on Sunday mornings. And I said, "Yep, I am." And she says, "Well, good for you." But I was feeling exhausted. I have to admit, I was feeling exhausted, so I told the joke, and I'll share it with you. It's not written down here. Put your political feelings aside for a moment. We had the fuss this week with Roseanne and the tweets that Roseanne sent out. And one of her excuses was that she took Ambien, and the Ambien made her racist. Well, the maker of Ambien said, "Well, our product, a lot of people take our product with no side effects at all. We acknowledge there are some side effects, but one of them is not racism." I told my coworkers, I said, I posted on Facebook this week to my friends and family that if they were having trouble sleeping, they didn't have to take Ambien. For a small fee, I would send them one of my sermons, and I guaranteed they'd be asleep in 10 minutes flat, and it wouldn't turn them racist. We need rest. We need relaxation. And we need Sabbath. No matter what day of the week that Sabbath is or when we do it. Doing that will reduce the number of heart attacks. It will reduce the number of divorces. So back to today's gospel. After the encounter, Jesus went to the synagogue where he encountered a man with a withered hand. And the Pharisees, who had been embarrassed in their first encounter with Jesus, were eager to give it another go. Let's try again. They watched to see if Jesus was going to heal that man with the withered hand on the Sabbath, so that they could again accuse him of violating the Sabbath law. So Jesus gave them another chance. First, he told the man to stand up. And then he asked the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" Well, that was well established in Sabbath law. People were permitted to help when life was in danger. They were permitted to help in emergencies. But as far as the Pharisees were concerned, this man's withered hand was no emergency. He had been like that for years. He could wait another day until the Sabbath had ended. But Jesus felt differently. And presumably the man with the withered hand felt differently too, because when Jesus told him to stretch out his hand, he did it. He stretched out his hand. I'm sure that wasn't easy for a man who had tried for years to hide his disability. This was a public place. Everybody was watching. And for once, this man was the center of attention, something that he'd always tried avoiding. But he had heard about Jesus, and he was willing to take a bit of a risk so that he might have a chance to be healed. So he stretched out his hand, and his hand was restored, it says. And then it tells us that the Pharisees, having been bested twice, huddled together with the Herodians to figure out a way to destroy Jesus, to kill him. So what do these stories mean for us today? One thing, they're to tell us that God created the Sabbath for us, to give us a restful day, a family day. God knew that we needed rest and that our families needed us to be present with them. And that's a pretty good takeaway from this lesson. For another thing, we need to pay attention when Jesus teaches us that in God's economy, it's always lawful to do good, to help someone in need, to rescue someone in danger. It's always lawful to save a life. It's always lawful to help. But there's a third lesson that should be taken away from today's lessons, and it's that Jesus is Lord and will bless those who trust him. That man with the withered hand trusted Jesus when he stretched out his hand. That doesn't mean that Jesus will always do what we want. It does mean, though, that Jesus is in command, and he will bless those who trust him. Jesus is Lord. He's Lord of those who trust him, and Lord over those who don't. The Pharisees didn't trust him, but he demonstrated his mastery, his lordship to them anyway. But the one who trusted was the one who really got blessed. Let us allow him to bless us as we trust him. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.